On behalf of the European Foundation for Democracy, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar organized in cooperation with the US mission to the EU and Political Capital. This is an event under EFT's disinformation program. As you may know, we have been witnessing a sharp rise in disinformation and propaganda campaigns in the last 2.5 months. Some countries, as well as some radical groups, have been using the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity, basically, to pursue their agenda and attack our liberal democratic societies with the aim of destabilizing the West. And they have also been using social media as one of the main tools to promote their agenda. Let me briefly introduce you to our speakers today who will provide us with analysis of these campaigns and how social media platforms have been used to spread disinformation, propaganda, and fake news. Our first speaker is Peter Kreko. He's Director of Political Capital based in Hungary. And the second speaker is Pellegatta, Associate Director of Digital Forensic Research Lab at Atlantic Council. Our speakers will open the sessions by their analysis for 10 minutes each, and then we'll continue with a Q&A. You can type and send your questions and comments by using the Q&A box on your screen after or during these presentations. So we will start with Peter. Peter, thank you very much for joining us, but also collaborating with us as Political Capital to co-organize this event today. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Dear Murat, thank you very much. And let me also welcome all of you who came to see this event. And I'm really grateful for European Foundation for Democracy and also the US mission to the European Union to partnering this event, and also really happy to be in the same panel as Anna from DFR Lab. So I think a lot of things have been already told about COVID-19 and disinformation. So let me come up with some general remarks first, and then I would raise a few points about the landscape in the Visegrad 4 countries. So in Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, where we did some deeper analysis in the topic. So first of all, why social media? Why do we focus on social media in this event? According to most of the research that we can see, at least on the Western part of the world, still the social media is the most important source of disinformation and misinformation. So even if we talk a lot about the decline of the traditional media as it is, and decline of journalistic standards, in most of the mainstream media, we still have some kind of qualitative or quality content and filters that filter out some of the disinformation and misinformation, while on the social media these filters exist but still much more permeable than in the mainstream media. So second, I would say that there are some exceptions to this rule, because in some countries, and unfortunately Hungary is one of the countries in which we can talk about this tendency, there's an increasing trend of state-sponsored disinformation that mostly coming through the mainstream sources and government-funded media outlets. We can see, I think, some increasing signs for that in Poland as well. But luckily, we can say this is definitely not a general trend in the European Union. So if we talk about the EU disinfo landscape, I think the social media is still the most important source. Third point would be that according to some research of very good analysts, for example, of the Reuters Institute and Oxford University, the disinformation market is still pretty much supply driven. What does it mean? That despite the fact that fake news and conspiracy theories often paint themselves as, and the sources of fake news and conspiracy theories as the voice of the people who are just echoing the real suppressed opinions that doesn't appear anywhere else, what this research focusing on the UK, but I think the findings are more general than that, found is that while only 20% of the misinformation and disinformation around COVID-19 is coming from celebrities, politicians, and major opinion leaders. 69% of the engagements are created by such posts. So the most important, most influential sources of disinformation are still the opinion leaders, still the politicians, still the celebrities, and still the states. So that's why I think it's important to see that it's not that much bottom up, it's more top down phenomenon. And starting from this point, I would say a few words about the disinformation landscape in the V4 countries, where we did a brief analysis with some of our partners, and our results will be revealed soon. So what we found in the V4 is, first of all, Facebook is probably the most important source of disinformation, with a lot of users in Central Eastern European countries, and still the most important social media platform for spreading disinformation. There are fact checkers in all the V4 countries except one, certified fact checkers on Facebook except one, and this is Hungary. There are no certified fact checkers in Hungary, while the problem of disinformation is, I think, pretty well known, even the state sponsored for this audience. So I think it really is calling for some more activity on from the side of Facebook to invest in fact checking. We did a research on 15 disinformation pages in all the 4 countries, and what we found around COVID-19 is that about 30% of the Hungarian articles, 7-8% of Slovakian articles, and about 20% of the Czech articles contain some misleading statements. So even the ratio of the false statements and disinformation was highly uneven in the sample, and there is a very wide range of disinformation narratives by a variety of actors with a different set of motivation. The list includes pro-governmental, pro-opposition portals, far-right, far-left populist actors and their platforms, official channels of Moscow and Beijing, and also in some cases celebrities. So when we took a look at the misinformation around possible cures of the COVID-19, hydrogen peroxide and things like that, we found quite a lot of celebrities who spread this narrative. So anyone who already has a big impact on the public opinion are investing more in disinformation. And to tell a few words about Russian and Chinese disinformation, as pretty much in line with what we could read in the EU versus Disinfo report, the most important narratives of Russia-affiliated Facebook sites and disinformation portals are about, let's say, spreading a general discontent and destroying the trust in EU institutions. So a lot of Eurosceptic voices and, let's say, proofs of Euroscepticism on that. No one helped Italy, for example, in the European Union. It was only Russia that provided some help, and several other articles that point into this direction. The EU is falling apart, NATO is falling apart. So this kind of narrative that is about the decline of the West and the failure of Western institutions to treat with COVID-19, and still Russia is painted as a role model in fighting COVID-19, which is, in light of the facts, unfortunately, I think, not really true. When it comes to China, Chinese and Russian disinformation shows some overlaps, even in terms of sources, in retweets, in engagements, and even there is some cooperation between Russia-funded, state-sponsored disinformation, China state-sponsored disinformation sites. Still, there is, I think, a distinctive narrative and And this is that United States is mainly responsible for COVID-19, and this is what all China-related sites are pushing forward. We know that it was created in a laboratory in the United States, according to these sources, and then brought to Wuhan, and also with together with the mass diplomacy that China is doing all over the world. The narrative is a bit similar, that on the West is on the decline when trying to fight with the virus, and China is the only one who can bring some help and who can provide some aid in this situation. And the thing is that we do not know too much about the impact of these narratives, but we have already some polls from, for example, from Slovakia, that shows that much more people think that China and Russia provided some help than the European Union, which is, I think, a wake-up call. And I think it must be pretty general sentiment in the V4 countries. Again, we don't have enough polls so far to prove it, but I think so far authoritarian superpowers, Russia and China, or wannabe superpowers in the case of Russia, are investing a lot to let's say, to demolish the image of Western institutions and countries and improve theirs in contrast. And I think it definitely has an audience in V4 countries and in all over Europe. And this is something that should be taken seriously. I don't think this fight against authoritarian narratives, and as a lot of optimists already say, is over. And I don't think that the West have already won the fight.
Thank you very much, Peter. When also we talk about this issue, we always talk about it from the Western European and American perspective. So it's very good to understand what are the specifics of this issue in a country like Hungary. Also, when it comes to, I think, the social media monitoring, we have always been focusing on these languages, English, French, German, then yes, of course, Russian, Chinese, but we have been ignoring some language groups. So I think it's very important to highlight this need. Especially considering that how effective this propaganda activities can be influential in the Central and Eastern Europe. So Anna, the floor is yours now. You also have a presentation, as far as I understand.
Yeah, so I wanted to present some of the case studies that the DFR Lab identified in the past few years. So let me try to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Okay, so for if you're not familiar with the DFR Lab, first a quick introduction. The DFR Lab is set to identify, expose, and explain disinformation and overall hostile information manipulation and amplification on online and offline using open source data. So for our analysis, we often use social media monitoring tools like Meltwater, Batsumo, CrowdTangle, and others. Tools that we use to measure how some narratives spread online, what kind of audiences they reach, and what kind of impact they have. Since the COVID-19 outbreak in Europe, we of course started identified many different instances of disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and all different information manipulation types. And I want to present some of these case studies to explain how some of these narratives spread through social media, how they got picked up from one country to another, and try to again give a little bit of a few examples of these. The examples that I will present today come from Italy, first of all, because that's what I research, and second, because I would say, unfortunately, Italy provided in this time a lot of examples of different types of disinformation. I say different types because I like to categorize disinformation in these 5 macro categories. So the first one are narratives used for domestic political gain. Second is conspiracy theories and foreign propaganda, anti-EU, anti-NATO, anti-US narratives, and lastly, narratives that are recycled across countries. And I would say that most case studies not necessarily fit into only one of these categories, but often fit into more of these. So the first category is narratives used for domestic political gain. These, of course, depend on domestic political debates from country to country. In Italy, for example, immigration has been at the center of the political debate for years. So at the very beginning of the outbreak, DFR noticed that some moderate and far-right outlets and news blogs started spreading anti-immigrant sentiments and anti-immigrant narratives. So for example, from accusing the government of cutting public funds to the healthcare system to allocate the same funds to immigrants, to spreading hate and fear towards the migrants. And again, these examples come from Italy, but for example, a report from Grafica showed that similar narratives were spread across far-right communities online, also in France. So it's not only in Italy that these things happen. The second thing is conspiracy theories. Peter mentioned a few, and I'm sure that all of you are very familiar with the most famous ones, from Bill Gates being accused of profiting from the pandemic, to different governments being accused of creating the virus in laboratories. Again, there are many theories that circulate out there. And one that I found particularly interesting that reminds a little bit about the chemtrails conspiracy theories was generated in Italy. And it's about government helicopters flying over cities and spraying disinfectants to kill the virus. And the interesting thing is that, again, it was generated in Italy, but then it was translated and in different languages, and it spread across over 30 countries in about 2 weeks, which is pretty impressive. Then again, foreign propaganda. Peter again mentioned some of this, and this has been the focus of the debate for the past few months. So I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the propaganda, especially coming from China, Russia, and following the medical aids that China and Russia sent to countries like Italy. So these are the ones that you see here, some of the memes that started circulating on Italian social media, thanking China, Cuba, Russia, Albania for the medical aids, but never mentioning this, the medical support that the EU provided, or EU countries, or the US. So these kind of narratives, again, were spread by both domestic actors and matched the narrative spread by China and Russia, basically aimed at denigrating the EU and the EU response to coronavirus and support to its member states, while suggesting Russia and China as the main supporters and the main friends to EU countries. These are examples coming from Russia's state media. Again, amplifying the same narrative, so overselling the medical support that came from Russia while underselling the one that came from the EU. And these are examples coming from Chinese official social media that at some point started spreading these videos of Italians allegedly clapping and yelling from the balconies, the "Thank you, China," in recognition of the help that China sent to Italy. These videos were, in some cases, proved to be manipulated. In other cases, proved to be one specific person yelling out of the balcony, but not as spread as a phenomenon as these posts wanted to suggest. An Italian communications company also found out that China used bots to amplify an hashtag that says Forza Cina Italia, which means like go China in Italy. That again, as you can see here on the left, gained 60 million impressions on Twitter in only a few weeks. While on the right, you can see some of the pro-Russia content pushed by both Russia and domestic sources on Italian social media that gained a lot of impressions on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And I would say that the Russian and Chinese propaganda narratives are often very, very similar to narratives that are anti-EU, anti-NATO, anti-US, and that originate domestically. So the two phenomena kind of end up corroborating each other's and amplifying each other. So here you can find a few examples of, but there are many, many more of anti-EU content that was shared on Italian social media. So from the left, you can see the video of an Italian replacing the EU flag with a Russian flag. The video went viral on Italian social media, but was also picked up abroad, not only Russia, but also in other EU countries. Then you find memes depicting Russia and China as the saviors of Italy, while the EU is ready to, to attack or to kill Italy. Then there's a post from a pro-China Facebook account that claims that Germany stole masks from Italy, while again China was so generous to donate these masks for free. And the last one is an example from coming from the statement of a Russian official that claimed that Poland blocked its airspace to so preventing a Russian cargo plane to fly over Poland to bring medical supplies to Italy, and forcing the plane to a much longer trajectory. And of course, all these statements were proven wrong, but this didn't prevent these narratives to keep being amplified on social media. And again, similarly with anti-NATO narratives, including fear that NATO troops would spread the virus by moving within Europe, or conspiracy theories about the Europe Defender 20 exercise. And then anti-EU narratives, again, as Peter mentioned, either the US being accused of creating the virus in a lab, or even stealing test swabs from Italy, when instead of, again, helping Italy, which is an ally of the US. And last, the narratives are recycled across countries. So this is an example that comes from a video that was shared by an Italian conspiracy theory blog that is owned by a former communications consultant of the 5-Star Movement. The video is an interview to questionably reputable medical expert, we will call it, that suggested that smoking decreases the chances of getting the virus. And this video was then picked up by Ukrainian and Russian fringe media outlets, translated and amplified in, again, Ukrainian and Russian information environments. And interestingly enough, we found out that to share this story, some fringe media outlets used some mixed alphabetical characters to avoid platforms to automatically identify the story and take it down from the platform. And last, I want to share a case study that is the most recent case study that I worked on this past weekend, actually. This is particularly interesting because it contains a little bit all the things that we mentioned so far. And it's about an Italian member of parliament that was elected with the 5-Star Movement, and then she was expelled by the movement. And she's still at the parliament as part of what we call the mixed group. On last Thursday, she gave a speech at the Chamber of Deputies that was aimed at criticizing the government for its response to COVID-19, basically, but it ended up being 7 minutes where she covered all the most popular conspiracy theories about COVID-19, but also from previous conspiracy theories regarding Bill Gates, the vaccine in Africa, vaccines in India, as well as the deep state. So all the major conspiracy theories that we can think of. And it's interesting to notice that So first of all, I think that it's particularly interesting because these conspiracy theories usually live online on very specific communities on social media or online fringe media outlets, etc. But this is, you know, she brought it on the floor of the parliament, which is I would say a pretty important step. And her video started immediately being amplified on social media from the same conspiracy theory blog that I mentioned earlier for the about the Ukrainian case, so BioBlue, and it started amplifying the video on Facebook, on Twitter, and it got picked up by the community of anti-vaxxers, anti-5G, anti-EU supporters, again, both on Twitter and Facebook. And it's interesting, I think, that this is an analysis that I ran through Batsumo. And I think that it's interesting that the social media users engage the most with the content coming from YouTube, and in particular, YouTube videos, conspiracy theory videos that, again, showed their support to the Italian MP for expressing these concerns and finally telling the truth on the floor of the parliament. And then on Facebook, in less than 48 hours, social media users started creating groups in support to the MP. Some of these groups were also flagged via Facebook, which is something that I found out and I didn't know, that Facebook flags some of these groups for discussing vaccines. And in that case, Facebook provides the links to the WHO website, basically inviting the social media users to go and find more reliable information. Again, examples of her video being shared on groups and pages on Facebook, followed by communities, again, against the European Union, against the 5G, against vaccines. So basically to show that all these communities are basically the same, or at least overlap in some sense, and, you know, often amplify the very similar narratives. There's also an hashtag that went viral in, again, gained 5 million impressions on Twitter in less than 48 hours, and the translation of the hashtag is I stand with the Sara Cunha, which is the name of the MP. And her name also gained 52 million impressions in, again, less than 48 hours on Twitter, not only thanks to her, you know, these impressions include also news, not necessarily only supporters, but 52 million impressions in 48 hours is still a pretty impressive volume. And here you can see screenshots of posts that show of social media users that show their support, not only from Italy, but also from with tweets in French, English, Spanish, etc. And lastly, that I think it's also very relevant for today's conversation is the fact that the MP, but as well as other communities that often spread these kind of conspiracy theories and disinformation are increasingly becoming more vocal against Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and also basically all those mainstream platforms that have been increasingly monitoring the content shared on their websites. And again, these communities and the MP herself accuse these platforms of censorship because they banned in the past content that they shared on those platforms, and are moving and are relying increasingly more on different platforms. These screenshots come from Telegram, for example. So I think that this is an interesting trend that needs to be considered when we discuss, you know, regulation of social media, because again, there are also many more platforms that we don't necessarily always take into consideration.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think this was very interesting because we often talk about these issues, but it's very great to see all the samples and also the dynamics behind these campaigns. So actually, first question is also connected to that. Nevşin Mengü, a Turkish journalist, is asking, do the governments in Italy and or Hungary are planning to somehow regulate social media using disinformation spread on social media as an excuse? I can maybe enlarge the question by adding that obviously more regulation brings more problems on social media as well, because it's a tool for freedom of speech. So how should we really deal with this issue within our liberal democratic systems in line with the democratic principles as well? Peter, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's a crucial, important question, an extremely difficult one, and I don't think we can elaborate on all the important aspects here. I do think that when it comes to regulation, and especially self-regulation of social media, it is definitely something extremely important, and I myself do not really regard social media platforms as, let's say, platforms of totally free speech, for the simple reasons that there are algorithms in place that we simply do not know, and they are not transparent, and they are amplifying some opinions and burying some others. In some cases we know about these processes, in some others not. So I think the issue of regulation, self-regulation should go beyond this freedom of speech debate. On the other hand, I do think, I do think that unfortunately still there are a lot of things to do by social media companies. According to Oxford Institute and Reuters Institute and their studies, Facebook has been probably the most eminent surface in terms of removing and burying disinformation or misinformation content, with Twitter with different kind of policies, less active in this respect. It is a complicated picture, and I think regulation is important, but I think in Hungary we can see let's say, a case where how you can abuse these problems with the social media companies in a way that is totally against any kind of democratic standards. What is happening in Hungary these days is that people were brought in the police and interrogated by the police officers just because posting on the social media some content that were governmental critical, but by a new regulation, a new restriction of the criminal code in Hungary, spreading hoaxes around COVID-19 can be punished for up to 5 years in prison. So, and really there were 87 cases so far in which the police started some kind of investigation because of spreading hoaxes. And if it means that people are brought to the police because of expressing some opinion against the government, this is definitely not the direction that we should go to. Also, Hungarian government is one of the loudest advocates of restrictions on social media companies and also to regulate them more harshly. And I think they have at least, they have an important hidden motivation here. They so far could use Facebook, I think, as an extremely efficient propaganda tool for their purposes. On the other hand, with more vigilance on the side of Facebook and social media companies, it is going to be less and less difficult. So on the one hand, they need an enemy that they can fight with. This is something that Anna was referring to, and populist right-wing politicians are all around the globe are just love bashing social media on social media platforms in a lot of cases and abusing their advantages to the maximum. On the other hand, I think, yes, this is definitely one platform that the Hungarian government simply cannot really control, and why they are controlling about 80% of the Hungarian media, they definitely cannot do with it with the social media. So it's definitely a source of danger from an authoritarian perspective, and that's why I think we have to be extremely cautious about let's say hyping these voices that let's regulate the social media more. Yes, this is important, but it's probably not the perfect timing to jump onto this train and discuss it in details in this environment.
Yes, thank you, Peter. It also reminds me of this new law in Russia against the fake news, basically. So while targeting fake news, according to the Russian governmental perspective, obviously, they are also using it to silence journalists, but also the critics on social media. That's why we need to be very careful. Anna, are there any discussions in Italy about social media and how to stop this?
So I don't have insights on their relations or the conversations that the government is carrying on with social media per se. But for example, the Italian government just announced a few weeks ago a task force to counter disinformation related to COVID-19. Again, I don't have particular insights on how this task force is working or on the again on the impact that this task force is having on whether we see less disinformation spreading. But I think that it's still a pretty important first step from the government to at least acknowledge the fact that there is a huge problem that disinformation poses a very substantial threat to citizens. And when it comes to social media regulations, I think that, as Peter said, I think that it's a very sensitive topic for different reasons. Again, one of them is, as Peter mentioned, the fact that any kind of regulation can be used for good, but also to limit freedom of expression based on who regulates and who creates these policies. But also I think that another thing that we don't focus on enough is the fact that social media platforms are simply vehicles for communication. So we often, especially in these communities that focuses on countering and identify disinformation, we often focus on the bad things that happen on social media. But for many bad things that happen, also a lot of good things happen. Like social media created more access globally to information, created movements across worldwide for people to, for citizens empowerment. There are many good things that happen on social media. And I believe that although it's extremely important that social media platforms take their responsibilities and regulate themselves and start monitoring what happens on their own website, on their own platforms, but that cannot be the only step that governments and policymakers focus on. Because again, as the examples that I gave earlier, for Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Google that work on regulating their own platforms more and more throughout the years, there are many more platforms that are created every day that are not necessarily following the same rules as Facebook, Twitter, Google, and YouTube. So I think that the conversation needs to be a little bit broader than simply hoping that these social media platforms will regulate themselves. One step that Facebook recently took was to announce Supreme Court, basically a board for for content regulation that is an independent board from Facebook, and that has 40 experts from academia, lawmaking, journalists, human rights, and other former policymakers, etc., to make sure that to have a more independent process when it comes to identify content that needs to be banned from the platform, and to avoid that Facebook is accused every single time they ban some content from the platform to be accused of limiting the freedom of speech or censoring some content. And I think that that's a fairly important step coming from Facebook. But again, I don't think that that's enough, because bad actors will continue to exist, and if they feel like their reach is limited on platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Google, they will simply move to a different platform, which is what we already saw in many cases, either going to encrypted messaging apps like Telegram and WhatsApp, or other websites with different domains. One example comes from InfoWars, which is one of the most famous far-right conspiracy theory blogs in the US. It was banned from Facebook, Twitter, Google, etc., and it recently reappeared under a different domain on a different website. So it's, again, like regulating platforms is an extremely important step that needs to be taken seriously. At the same time, it cannot be the only thing that we focus on, because it will not be disinformation and conspiracy theories, and beyond that, harmful content, violent content, pornography, and all the content that is even more harmful will not stop spreading simply because we regulate two of the platforms that we know.
Thanks, Anna. Actually, it is the same for radical jihadist groups as well. We have been seeing the similar trend. For example, when ISIS was very active on social media, whenever there was more pressure on Facebook and Twitter, they also moved to other social media platforms, but also they started to use Twitter and Facebook wisely, meaning that they knew their limits, but they were back to make their propaganda, basically. So the next question is from Kostas Preyar. We certainly see a surge in conspiracy theories. Do we also see a surge in extremism across Europe? To what degree are they related during this particular crisis? Maybe what I can add to this, at least from our perspective at the European Foundation for Democracy, we have also been seeing that radical groups have been using this very well as well, far right, far left, and jihadist groups. So how do you see this happening, especially in Italy and Hungary specifically? So what other extremist groups have been using these campaigns to promote basically their agenda? Would you like to start, Peter?
Yeah, I think very briefly, of course, it's amplifying the messages of the even extreme right. And I think the nature of this virus is that, yeah, you can pretty easily argue against open borders, against European integration, against, let's say, against any kind of openness towards foreigners, and it can easily have some how to say, racist aftertaste as well. So you can argue against, yeah, mixing races and nations and cultures, and because it doesn't bring any good. So of course, and you can spread a lot of conspiracy theories, no question. And they do it. How efficient, and there are higher engagements, but I mean, to be frank, there is almost higher engagement on everyone these days, because everyone is spending everything, because everyone is spending more time on the social media. So how efficient it really can be in terms of recruitment, in terms of organizing themselves, in terms of broadening the outreach, I'm not entirely sure. And I think we have to wait and see. My expectation would be that radical and extremist groups will have easier times recruiting their bases and broadening their bases when the economic crisis will be deeper. So not necessarily as a direct consequence of the pandemic, but when, and this is what we could see in the previous economic crisis as well, that not in the first run, not immediately, but with a few years delay, it can be 2-3 years, when the social consequences of the economic breakdown will be stronger, then I think radical and extremist movements will have easier time to recruit their members. On the other hand, I think right now the authorities themselves are also upgrading their abilities to go against extremist groups with online surveillance, using phones for surveillance, and so on and so on. So I think it will be a quite complicated picture, but I would rather expect, only at least on the European level, more as a belated response and success by radical and extremist movements. And if we just take a look at the mainstream political parties as well, what we rather see so far is that whoever is on government could rather extend its support and popularity on the short run, which means that populists on government are enjoying an increasing trust, while Democrats on government are enjoying an increased trust as well. I think in the next wave, it will be rather the very opposite.
Anna?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have an answer exactly on the link between, the correspondences between pandemic and extremist groups, but it's something that I mentioned earlier. At DFR we identified some of these extremist community by being active on Telegram and using messaging apps that are relying on an encryption technology. And I think that is, that's always a debate that we need to have, and it goes far beyond only information operations, but the balance between privacy and security. So because for one end, encrypted messaging increases the level of privacy from users, and on the other end, it allows for these communities to have share violent content and extreme content without necessarily being detected. Again, I don't have an answer specifically on whether or not these activities increased during the pandemic or how it increased during the pandemic. I think that it's something that we will probably find out in in a bit of time. But this is, again, it's an interesting trend that we should talk about when with the broader conversations about where this balance stands, because when you regulate something, there's always another problem that comes up, and it's never easy to talk about these things.
So next question is from Joanna Rosinska. So while it's clear the propaganda and narratives match those propagated by Russia and China, can it be conclusively proven they are generated by state actors? Or to what degree? How? So basically, this is one of the challenges of also the External Election Service when they publish the report and when they continue their monitoring. So do you think we can confidently say that state actors are behind it? Or should we be more careful and nuanced while accusing states?
Yeah, hi, Joanna. Good to meet you. So yeah, I think, yeah, it's an extremely important question. The question of attribution. I think an interesting thing is that in a lot of countries where let's say these disinformation narratives from Russia and China are the most successful, you have the least let's say direct evidence and smoking gun to directly attribute it to any state actors. And the case of Hungary is a brilliant case, because if the pro-governmental Hungarian government financed mainstream channels are pushing pro-Russian and pro-Chinese narratives, you cannot really directly find any Russian actors that are involved in the process. So the impact is much more indirect. So I think the attribution is in a lot of cases very difficult. On the other hand, if we just, and that's why I think the EU versus disinfo let's say regular tracking is extremely important. If we just take a look at what Sputnik and Russia Today are spreading these days, and we can clearly track them using this website, and then we take a look at the narratives that are the most popular in the respective countries where we are doing our research. In a lot of cases, we see that the same narratives are circulating. Some of them are directly referring to Russia Today or Sputnik as a sources, some of them not. But if we focus more on the narratives and less on the sources, it's easier. And of course, I think it's easier for us analysts, as for Anna or us, that we usually have a lot of indirect circumstantial evidence to say that, yeah, if they are putting out the same content on many sites at the same time, and it's more or less the same as a let's say a Russia financed narrative that you can find on Russia finance source, then you can have enough reason to claim that it's most probably Russia linked. As a diplomatic actor, of course, the EU has to be a bit more cautious in this respect, but I think we have much more direct evidence usually about state involvement of Russia and China in disinformation that some EU, let's say, stakeholders like to acknowledge.
Yeah, so I would say that that's exactly right. I think that attribution is one of the most difficult things for all analysts of disinformation on a general basis. However, I would say that there is a distinction between, for example, in the case studies that I presented earlier, there are some examples that come from state-owned media and government officials' social media accounts. So in that case, you of course you will never have the certainty of how to what extent it was decided and from whom. But that is a pretty good example of the fact that it's not only communities online that are not linked to the government. I would say that that's a pretty good example of narratives and videos and content that are spread from sources linked to governments of Russia and China. On the other hand, for example, Italy, it's an interesting case because, as I mentioned earlier, some of these narratives that come from Russia and China merge perfectly with some content and narratives that are originated domestically. So, for example, anti-EU sentiment, it's not something that is necessarily generated from Russia and wouldn't exist without Russia or China interference. It's something that, has been growing domestically for years, as well as, all the Novax, 5G, all the conspiracy theories, anti-immigrant sentiment. Those are things that exist domestically no matter what. The interesting thing is that often they merge with propaganda narratives and are used from foreign state actors like Russia and China to basically spike division within the country. So it's difficult in those cases to to have 100% certainty of where that sentiment or where a specific narrative originated, but it's usually two worlds that kind of, again, as I said earlier, corroborate each other and amplifying each other. But again, there are also, as I said, there are also examples of sources spreading propaganda and disinformation that are directly linked to government.
So we have last 8 minutes and a few more questions. I will try to combine two connected questions, one from Bernard Weidinger and other one from Katerina Farina. Basically, their questions are that we have been talking about today, propaganda coming from China and Russia, targeting mostly EU, America, and NATO. But they're asking, should we also talk about the other side of it? Because there's also like a conspiracy theories against China, alleging that the virus was intentionally created by China as a biological weapon, for instance, or also the discourse of President Trump. This could also be considered as a disinformation propaganda campaign by the West. If not, why not?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, and thanks for raising that. I mean, I'm usually 100% again the, let's say, cynical, relativizing narrative that, yeah, United States and the EU is just doing the same what Russia and China is, just geopolitical power game and power of and war of narratives and so on, and it's the same on every side. So I totally disagree, because I think it's really not true. I mean, the Western institutions simply do not have their disinformation, let's say, machineries that Russia and China and other authoritarian regimes have built up, and it's an extremely important difference. So we really cannot draw any parallel between what, let's say, Sputnik and Russia Today, or even I would say the China Daily is doing, and we cannot compare it to what Euronews, or let's say RFERL is doing, because they follow totally different lines of journalistic standards. On the other hand, I think that the examples you brought up are important, and when leading US decision makers are making statements that are not much in line with the consent of the scientific community. I mean that the scientific community clearly claimed that it's not a man-made virus, it's a natural virus. And there's a lot of research on that. Also, when they sometimes go against the US intelligence consent, which practically says, again, it's not a man-made virus, but a natural virus. And they claim that it's clearly coming from a lab in Wuhan, and it was man-made. I think it definitely doesn't help. Why it doesn't help? Because it just fuels this kind of narrative that the US is just doing the same, and the EU is just doing the same as what Russia and China is doing. And of course, it's a campaign, right now campaign going on in the United States, and of course it adds to the already existing divisions. And we know that on the basis of divisions and polarization, there is a rising trend of disinformation, but still I think it's a problematic tendency.
Anna?
Yeah, I would say that the examples that they made of, disinformation narratives or ill-sourced news coming from the Trump administration or, from other Western sources, that is something that, for example, at the DFR Lab, we absolutely take into consideration. We don't necessarily only focus on Russia and China at all. Like, for example, in Italy, Salvini was one of the political actors that spreads anti-Chinese sentiments at the beginning. So those are all things that are absolutely valid, and we absolutely do take into consideration. I think that, as Peter said, though, there's a huge difference when it comes to the machine and the intention behind these information operations, and I think that one of the easiest examples that make these understand is what happens domestically. So the domestic information environments of these countries, like the US, Italy, most European countries are democracy, and although there are domestic sources spreading disinformation, there will always be a counter environment that spreads, that debunks that information and spreads the truth, or at least proves scientific evidence or other sort of evidence to those disinformation narratives. While Russia and China are authoritarian countries where the information environment is strictly centralized and controlled. So I think that, again, disinformation is definitely not something happening only in China, Russia, or Iran, or authoritarian regimes, or coming only from there. But the scale and the lack of counter machine is what makes the two world different, in my opinion.
We have quite a few more questions, but I will finalize this webinar with the last question, actually, with a country Anna, you have just mentioned. Also, the European Union report was also mentioning two other countries than Russia and China. One was Iran, one was the Assad regime in Syria. So the last question is on Iran, actually, from Muner Alris. So this information was also used internally by the Iranian regime to justify the uncontrollable spread of the virus. So the question is, which reliable sources of information people in totalitarian regimes can follow to avoid this? And maybe I can just add on top of this, if while you were monitoring this information, have you also seen propaganda disinformation coming from this region, from Iran as well? And if you can just finalize your words within 2 minutes, I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you for the question. I'm really far from being an expert of Iran, so I will be pretty brief here. I would just say a general remark. I think the more, unfortunately, the more autocratic, more totalitarian a regime is, the more the citizens themselves have to really treat official narratives as with suspicion, but it comes with a price as well, because what we could see in Iran, for example, that there was a very successful disinformation that were spread by many sides, that methyl alcohol is successful in preventing the coronavirus, which led to the death of hundreds. So the problem is that even extreme trust in governmental narratives and mistrust is something that can lead to a malevolent effect of disinformation. But that's why I think authoritarian, in the case of authoritarian countries, I think the problem of disinformation is simply higher, because the governments are spreading it with higher efficiency. On the other hand, anti-government disinformation can fuel up a lot of problems as well, and narratives. And another, but not strictly connected, response to a question before, when I mentioned that the importance of fact checking and that especially on the level of Facebook is important. It's not only Hungary, for example, where there are no certified fact-checking organizations, but in the countries of Western Balkans, most of them, and the countries of Eastern Partnership countries, there aren't any as well. So I think, it would be an important point even to raise in discussions of, let's say, EU institutions and of social media companies.
Anna, last words.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on this. Again, I'm also not an expert on Iran, but that is something that the DFR global team is looking at in terms of where can citizens of authoritarian regimes find information. That very much depends, I believe, on a case-to-case basis. You know, there are countries where access to internet, access to information sources is limited. So in that case, I wouldn't have a recommendation, but there are also countries where the information environment is protected by the governments, but citizens can still rely on trustworthy sources coming from either local journalists that live abroad or international media sources, and that is a little bit what we try to do at the DFR Lab. So besides from in-house analysis and reporting, what we try to do is to teach basic fact-checking and source verification skills to citizens, so that hopefully everyone in a long run can just whenever reads a news or a piece of information, can apply some critical thinking and take that information with a grain of salt, and apply basic fact-checking process to verify the information themselves. I mean, this is part of our mission, and I know there are many other organizations out there that are doing the same. So hopefully in the long run, it will work.
I will just read one comment to be fair with our participants, just a correction from Bernard, because I was combining two different questions. So he says that he wasn't meaning that the West and US was doing the same as China, but his question was more about anti-Chinese propaganda or takes off to the far right, not the government agencies in the Western countries, basically. So I would like to thank you very much, Anna and Peter, for your excellent contributions, and also our participants. Just a reminder, our next event on this issue is actually this Wednesday at 5 p.m. Brussels time on transatlantic perspectives on propaganda and disinformation campaigns. And Luz Gülner, Head of Strategic Communications at the European External Action Service, and Daniel Kimmich, Principal Deputy Coordinator of the Global Engagement Center, will be joining us. I hope very much that you can also join us on Wednesday. Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.